Despite some beautiful designs and wonderful ideas, Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice is the worst Souls-like game From Software has ever released, by far. For every decision that works, there is another so baffling that it ruins the entire experience, and makes this a title that is decidedly callous and unfair. It breaks the rules Miyazaki has set out for the series, and concerns itself far more with being difficult than being rewarding. These were my thoughts all the way through to near the end of my first playthrough of the game. Now, if you would kindly allow for it, I'd like to take the time to illustrate why I felt this way, why these thoughts were incorrect, and why, more so than any other medium, it is important to keep your mind as open as possible while critiquing a game. I decided to buy Sekiro a little over a month after it released. I had successfully suppressed the urge to spend money I wasn't comfortable spending at the time, and resigned myself to the fact that I wouldn't be getting my hands on the snazzy letter opener that served as a pre-order bonus. All throughout the subsequent month, I was careful to avoid major spoilers, and was left frowning each time I saw a video on the topic come through my subscription box on YouTube, unsure of how long it would be until I finally got to play the game for myself, and then later experience the thoughts and feelings of others afterward. I had heard whispers of the quality of the title, though, and watched a few of the bite-sized, consumer-oriented reviews from places like IGN and Easy Allies. For the most part, people were saying the same things they always said about From Software Souls-like titles, that Sekiro was a masterpiece in nearly every conceivable way, outside of a few little cracks. I can't say that this was particularly surprising to me, and though I scarcely agreed with the idea that games like Bloodborne, Demon's Souls, and Dark Souls 3 are so perfect, I was at least comforted by the understanding that the game seemed to be exactly what the series usually produced in terms of quality. The only murmurs of complaints I caught wind of, aside from the tired discussion about whether Sekiro needs an easy mode or not, were related to some sort of enemy with bull in the name not being particularly learnable, and therefore coming across as a sharp spike in difficulty. That, and the final boss being so demanding that even hardcore Souls veterans were a little put off by it. This concerned me a bit. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't worried with the release of each new Souls game, worried that Miyazaki and the team had finally gone off the deep end and started making titles that lost that signature overt fairness that underlined the vast majority of the content in the previous titles. To have your final boss, one of the most important moments in the game, be considered too extreme for many hardcore fans, that didn't sit well with me. Assuming this complaint was accurate, why didn't they put in the effort needed to get their final boss right? Of course, even after the dust had finally begun to settle, the prevailing thought was the same as it always was. This was the hardest Souls-like game From had made yet. It was always this way, and after Bloodborne I started ignoring this sentiment. Bloodborne realistically gave players far more options on average than your regular Souls game, because builds didn't restrict players in the same way as they did in Dark Souls. You didn't specialize in the same way, and your choices therefore didn't preclude changing tactics near as much as they usually did. As far as I understood, Sekiro leaned into this idea even more, with a preconceived protagonist who only has one build, and synergizing abilities that work more like a traditional action game moveset, rather than the class building of an RPG. This was a game where you theoretically always had all the options you needed to tackle your next roadblock. If anything, Sekiro should be the least challenging of the series, in theory, with execution being the only major challenge. And yet, this only made me more wary of the chatter I heard. With such focused character growth and design, why were people upset with the final boss? The battle kept popping into the back of my mind, with my imagination running wild as to why it could possibly be such a challenge. What was going on here? Things only got more worrisome when I finally decided to pick the game up and see for myself. As soon as I laid my copy of the game on the GameStop counter, the employee, with whom I was vaguely acquainted, asked me if I wanted a used copy instead. so that I could return it if I found it too challenging. A tinge of panic raced through my chest. He warned me that Souls games were notoriously difficult and shouldn't be taken lightly. Despite being well aware of this fact, I swallowed hard and forced a smile, explaining that I'd beaten every other Souls game in the series a multitude of times, spent well over 1,000 hours playing them, and even gotten the Platinum Trophy on Bloodborne. These aren't exactly amazing accomplishments, mind you, so I wasn't quite sure if I was divulging such a comprehensive list of my accomplishments as confirmation of my want to purchase the game, or if I was trying to justify the risk to myself. Still, the panic faded quickly as I realized that I was more than equipped to best another Souls title. The ego in me argued that even if it did have some problems, I'd be able to beat it without much more effort than usual. That thought was deflated almost immediately when he, too, remarked about how challenging and arguably unfair the final boss was supposed to be. He revealed that he, too, had beaten all of the previous games, and was having a rather hard time with Sekiro. With a slight air of timidness in my voice, I asked if the new copy came with anything in particular that I wouldn't get with a used copy. No, there was no pre-order DLC, no soundtrack code, nothing. Convincing myself that it was therefore worth saving $5, I agreed, and was given a shiny, practically new copy of Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice. As I walked out, I still wasn't quite sure whether I'd gone pre-owned out of a lust for savings or out of fear. It must have been fear, since I convinced myself not to capture footage of my first playthrough. After all, I justified in my head, maybe I won't find enough to talk about in a review anyway, and if I do find the game so excellent that it's worthy of discussing on the channel, I'd be happy to play through it again a second time, right? It wasn't long until I had the game up and running. At first, I was enjoying myself, with my only real complaint being the frame rate. It was unlocked, meaning that it attempted to hit 60 FPS wherever it could, but according to the Digital Foundry video on the topic, it rarely actually hit that number. I'm one who prefers consistent frame rates, whether they're at 30 or 60. I can deal with an unlocked frame rate, especially over terrible frame pacing at 30 frames per second. But for some reason, the frame rate in Sekiro felt particularly choppy and awful. It didn't quite make sense, since according to the metrics given by Digital Foundry, Sekiro usually held a slightly higher frame rate than games like Dark Souls 3 or Final Fantasy 15, both of which felt better than this. Why were games with objectively choppier frame rates smoother? I wonder if there's a specific reason for it, or if I've just become even more sensitive to such inconsistencies. I posted on Twitter on the very day I'd gotten the game. This should have been my first clue that something was wrong. And it was, but not in the way it needed to be. Frustration bubbled up in my stomach just a bit, knowing that From's constant choice to be okay with subpar performance was once again negatively affecting my experience with one of their titles. It had been long enough. They had seen how much people appreciated the solid performance of the Dark Souls 1 remaster, and how much people begged to get the same effort in the other titles. And yet, once again, From gave the base console owners horrible frame pacing and pro console owners inconsistent performance. Still, with nothing to be particularly suspicious about, since this was normal, I simply sucked it up, made a mental note to condemn From's choices to not give players performance options if/when I reviewed the game, and moved on. I made it all the way to the Chained Ogre and detoured through the Hirata estate, since I remembered hearing that the ogre was weak to a fire attack found in said estate. Having gotten the basic understanding of what the game was, so to speak, I was pretty safe in assuming that the fire wouldn't break the battle, but rather just give me another option. My feelings on the game were muddy and inconsistent at this point, though. There were times where I could be found cursing under my breath in irritation after a death, which was very uncommon with my first experiences in other Souls games outside of Dark Souls 3 and the first quarter of my initial Dark Souls 2 playthrough. Barring these exceptions, my first playthrough of a Souls-like title always felt fair, and deaths felt justified, even in games not made by them, like Nioh. but that just wasn't the case with Sekiro. I was simultaneously overwhelmed with delight at the new mechanics, the beautiful level design, the engaging mob encounters, and the options I had for tackling them, while also being confronted with anger at a bunch of small things that really added up to cripple the experience. It wasn't long before I was ranting on Twitter about said experience, partially to vent my issues, and partially in the vain hope that somebody would have a miracle solution to all my problems, something I was clearly doing wrong that I just didn't realize. It had to be there, right? So just what were the problems I was experiencing? Well, firstly, I happen to have one of the louder PS4 Pro models. Unlucky for me, because while playing Sekiro, I regularly can't hear the game over the console unless I use headphones or turn the television volume far higher than it has any right to be. At the back of the console, the noise levels registered as high as 100.3 decibels. Even now, I still don't exactly know what it's like to play through Sekiro while being able to hear it properly. That's not really the game's fault, though giving me the option to lock the frame rate to 30 or lower the resolution to 1080p would certainly help. Up to this point, I'd also been having a lot of trouble with deflections. I've more or less mastered Dark Souls parries at this point. I'm good at timing these sorts of things, so why did they feel so off in Sekiro? Whenever I tried to time them precisely, it felt like I had to press the button far earlier than I should have. Wolf seemed to have a huge windup for the first deflection. I was kind of expecting the timing to be slightly different from Dark Souls parries, of course. The timing for Bloodborne staggers with your gun is different too. But my frustration wasn't helped by the fact that it kind of felt like just mashing the deflect button was far more consistent than timing it properly. What were From Software playing at, allowing for such lazy design of an otherwise beautiful mechanic? In fact, a lot of stuff felt really slow. Jumping had an enormous windup and an absolutely awful 8-direction limitation, which often sent me in the wrong direction, ruined stealth kills from the air, caused dodges to freak out the camera or get me hit, and it even shoved me off a cliff on occasion. Sprinting was slow to start up, and the waiting period from the beginning of a sprint to the point where you can sprint jump was a literal eternity. Some arenas for fighting mini-bosses and bosses didn't feel like they were large enough to allow you to ever safely heal or regain posture, because enemies are so fast in Sekiro. Speaking of, the camera in tight spaces felt like a genuine nightmare, and was responsible for the vast majority of my deaths against bosses by the end. It loved to get stuck behind objects, obscure my vision, stop facing enemies and bounce around trying to recover, and if this happened for a split second too long, it would unlock from the enemy, completely changing my controls because they'd no longer be relative to the position of said enemy. The game warned me that if an enemy's posture recovered quickly, it's best to whittle down their health, as that will slow their posture recovery down, but it felt impossible to get attacks on a lot of enemies who seemed to read my mind and block every attack. When I got my first combat art, I was immediately turned off by them, because half the time when I tried to cancel an attack with a block or deflect, Wolf would decide to do my currently equipped combat art instead. This was actually an enormous problem that didn't just affect combat arts. Every From Software Souls-like game uses an input buffer system that stores button presses for a short time. That way you don't have to be frame perfect with things like dodges or attacks to pull them off successfully. If something's in the buffer, as soon as your character's recovered, that action will take place. In Sekiro, this affected every action I took, from jumping, to attacking, to grappling, to blocking, to deflecting, to dodging, to sprinting, to healing. Everything interacted with the buffer system. It even felt like invincibility frames on dodges and jumps were potentially inconsistent for this reason, as if the buffer system kind of ate them somehow. Your gut feeling should argue that, since this game requires significantly faster and more precise inputs than even Bloodborne does, extending the buffer window could help players who are much worse at timing things properly. This would also explain why it felt better to mash deflect rather than time it. But that logic is flawed, and experimentation should instead reveal that this sort of a system gets in the way in a faster game. You see, even though this does allow for less precise timing of inputs, it also relies on the game to decide which actions to prioritize if you choose to switch actions before the initial one had been activated. So if you're mashing attack, storing it in the buffer while you're still recovering from a healing animation, but then a split second later you realize you actually need to jump over a sweep attack instead and start mashing the jump button, the game has to choose which input is the one that actually ends up being read, the jump or the attack. How it does so is dependent on how the system is programmed, and is completely invisible to the player. You have no real choice in the matter. This can lead to tons of inputs that come out unintentionally, simply because you already changed your mind about what you wanted to do. I was confused by these sorts of problems. Were they because of whatever was exacerbating the juddery nature of the frame rate? Was I just playing the game wrong, implying that the tutorials were an absolute mess that once again only told you 1/10 of the information players actually deserved to be clued in on? Or was the buffer system indeed extended for such a long length of time that the game refused to update my inputs as fast as my mind could do? It really backs up the impression I've gotten since Bloodborne, that From's main Souls-like team really seems to struggle with speed, I bellowed on Twitter in mounting anger. Beyond this, the death system was kind of frustrating to me. While I often enjoyed the surprises inherent to the way From Software divulges information about how their systems work, I didn't really want to deal with that here. Before I'd played the game, I'd gotten the impression that using your revivals was what would negatively impact your game. It makes sense, right? You're betraying the forces of nature and the natural order by being revived on the spot, so that should negatively impact you, one would think. So I ignored the revival system and refused to use it for the first few deaths, until Dragonrot affected the sculptor and the tutorial explanation popped up to reveal that I'd had it backwards. True death is what you actually want to avoid, with revivals having no consequences. But why do I want to avoid true death as a mechanic? The tutorial posits that Dragonrot is harmful and will affect more and more people as you continue to die. How, though, the game doesn't illustrate. So after I figured this out, I spent the first chunk of hours retreating back to the safety of Buddha statues every time I revived. It was obnoxious, to say the least, having to basically make 2 trips each time I failed. In Dark Souls, you were safe to give everything you had because when you died, you were automatically spawned back at the last bonfire. But here, if I wanted to avoid the consequences of Dragonrot, whatever they were, I had to weigh the unknown risks of true death against the absolute boredom and shame and tedium that came with walking all the way back to the last statue, only to then be able to finally try again. It was wasting my time twice over. As an idea, that's really tedious, and it didn't allow me to go all in after my first revival. And once I got to my first boss, Gyobo Oniwa, I gave up on the system entirely. I still didn't know the repercussions of true death, and knew that I couldn't exit boss battles without cheesing the game by exiting to the main menu. So I said screw it, and died to my heart's content from then on. Still, I found Gyobu was pretty fair, thanks to the open arena and clear, deflectable, slow attacks. But by the time I got to the end of the first act of the game, and was facing Genichiro, I was genuinely upset with the game. At this point, I was fighting the game, not the boss. This feeling had been mounting for the last 15 or so hours. It took me over 70 attempts to beat Genichiro, which was extremely demoralizing considering I'd heard people complaining that the final boss was difficult enough to take some people upwards of even 50 tries. I don't suck at these games, I exclaimed truthfully in my head. This game just f***ing sucks. This series had been getting more sloppy in design with every entry, particularly since they had entered this console generation. Bloodborne had some baffling problems with things like blood vials, and Dark Souls 3 was even worse thanks to their obsession with making a fast-paced title at any cost. It was only a matter of time before they made a game I couldn't defend, a Skyrim moment, where the hubris accrued through their accolades had finally translated into a game that focused more on pushing the things they were known best for, rather than actually making a good game. Sekiro had a beautiful game hidden underneath, but it wasn't a good game. It was a mess. As a way to vent, I mocked the idea that Sekiro was inherently good just because it was a From Software title on Twitter. Sekiro was supposed to be hard, so it's okay, I scathingly quoted the vague idea, while comparing it to the way people used to defend Bethesda's myriad of constant bugs and issues. Well, it's not okay, I responded. A good 50% of my deaths have been unfair. By the time I'd gotten to the Guardian Ape, I was getting desperate for the game to end. I didn't want to feel bad about this anymore. I wanted to forget the fact that I now had to confront the reality that From Software may finally be entering that downward spiral that I always feared from my most respected development studios. I was getting used to all of Sekiro's nonsense, and yet I still wasn't enjoying anything but the exploration and the levels. I couldn't hear the story half the time through fan noise, so it was more or less just me reading subtitles. I couldn't stand the mild headaches the performance would sometimes give me. I struggled against so many different types of enemies, with the only solace being the ability to stealth kill them or sneak past them. Still, I was nearly done with the game. I could feel it. And sure enough, not long after that I was facing Owl. Surprisingly, this went well. It took me probably 20 to 30 or so tries, rather than the 70-ish that Genichiro required. I was below the arbitrary threshold of failure that had been set for the final boss. At this point, I was mostly just fighting the awful camera, though I still wasn't using most of the mechanics because of the other issues. They just got in the way, so I instead needed to really emphasize taking things slow, keeping my posture low, health high, spamming deflect against combos, and doing singular pokes whenever I had an opening. I spent a lot of time running around in bosses rather than fighting. Immediate frustrations had subsided, replaced with the grim understanding that the game controlled my pacing. Just like in Dark Souls before it, there was a tug-of-war between my choices and those of the game. Where a game like Nioh allowed you to be proactive at nearly any moment against every struggle, this is something From Software had only done at the absolute highest levels of play in their titles. It was really only the speedrunners and people who devoted their entire beings to Souls that controlled their entire experience. This was fine for slower titles like Dark Souls, but the same seemed to be true of Sekiro, which felt wrong. On and on I trudged, surprisingly beating the corrupted monk in about 12 tries. Though this was a temporary high, I wasn't dumb enough to believe that this was the only fight with this boss. 1 health bar? Gimme a break. Bosses at this point were all at either 2 or 3 health bars, including many of the mini-bosses. I wasn't looking forward to the reality of facing this boss again when it finally came time to do so. On May 23rd of 2019 is when my revelation finally came. I'd fought my way through everything outside of the final new area, the Fountainhead Palace. I made my way down to the first statue, then onto the bridge. My expression didn't waver at all when I realized that, indeed, the corrupted monk was back, with 3 new phases to fight through. It was less than a half an hour before I had this battle in the books. I stopped to take a break, and realized, thanks to Digital Foundry, that Red Dead Redemption 2 had reworked their HDR implementation. Red Dead 2 was so big that I deleted it before I got my 4K HDR display. It was the most amazing looking game I'd seen up to that point, and seeing it in actual HDR was a compelling thought. I had the space on my console at the moment, so I reinstalled it. After messing with the in-game settings, I started roaming around. The game immediately looked strange. It looked like it was trying to run at a frame rate above 30 FPS, which is something I knew wasn't changed in a patch. It was most certainly still locked to 30 FPS. The light in my mind grew brighter and brighter as a realization suddenly dawned on me. I grasped for my remote, entered the display presets, and understanding washed over me as I stared at the current setting. HDR Vivid. As with most televisions these days, my current display has many different modes for different purposes. This includes a game mode, which turns off all of the major post-processing that would normally induce input lag. However, the television also stores the standard dynamic range and high dynamic range settings separately. I don't have much HDR content to use with the display as of now, so it's not used particularly often. Apparently, whatever I'd last used the HDR mode for wasn't a game, because it wasn't set to game mode. This meant that it was doing all sorts of stuff under the hood, including using TrueMotion to feign higher frame rates by including a bunch of extra interpolated frames. I turned Red Dead off in a flash, my heart beating fast in my throat. I crammed Sekiro's disc into my PS4 Pro, entered the application, and waited in silence. The time it took to enter my file felt like an eternity, but once I was in, relief engulfed me. The game felt crisp, it felt sharp, it felt fast. I had played all the way through the Fountainhead monk fight, with an enormous chasm of input lag in between my button presses and the response on the screen, without ever realizing it. Suddenly, I felt like a complete idiot for not realizing it. It made such a transformative difference. It didn't feel possible that I couldn't have recognized this before. Why hadn't I noticed the problem when doing things like navigating the menus? The only reason I can think of is the reason that kept popping up in my head beforehand. From Software games were usually rather slow, even Bloodborne. They usually had harsh wind-ups and cooldown animations. They usually felt weighty and calculated, so my mind rationalized the sluggish feeling of Sekiro by arguing that this was just how From games feel. And plenty of games have laggy menu response, why should that tip me off? Fear once again entered my being. Maybe this was placebo. Of course the game would objectively feel more responsive now, but maybe my expectation and hopes were making it feel like a bigger difference purely because I expected a difference. Maybe the game still had a lot of the problems I was feeling, just to a marginally lesser effect. I wanted to take to Twitter and announce my mistakes so badly, but I had to wait. I had to at least spend a few more hours with the game to see if the input lag really was the problem. It was. I have never been more happy to have been wrong about a game than I was when I was typing out my mistakes on Twitter. I had spent nearly 50 hours in despair and anger. I tried to keep my mind as open as possible, but things never changed or improved. The game had felt like a mistake, and no matter what perspective I tried to swap to, nothing had helped. 2 days later, I had done everything the game had to offer, and had beaten the final boss. It took me about 15 tries. As soon as I'd beaten that boss and proven that I could do it without feelings of being tortured to death, I readied myself for another playthrough. This time, I was going to play the game properly, without input lag. This time, I was going to get the alternate ending that forces you to beat the harder second fight with Owl, the fight that was considered the most difficult in the game. The next day, I set up my capture card, and for the next week, I recorded my second playthrough. It took less than half the time to finish than my first playthrough, despite doing everything both times. After just 6 hours, I'd already gotten through Genichiro, and up to that point, I'd only died a true death 4 times too. Once intentionally to capture footage, and 3 times against Lady Butterfly. It took me upwards of 70 tries to beat Genichiro my first time. 70 tries. And I beat him on my first attempt the second time around. In fact, by the end of the game, I'd only died 6 true deaths, the last 2 being against the double Guardian Ape fight and against the final boss. Granted, I was now using the cheesing method of exiting fights if I'm confident that I can't win, but even with that, you could maybe add an extra 10 true deaths, which is paltry when compared to the hundreds I'd experienced previously. Every encounter was significantly easier, and it clearly wasn't just because I knew what was coming either. There was such a stark contrast between my initial struggles and those of the second playthrough that it was abundantly clear how much damage the input lag had caused. For all intents and purposes, it had ruined my first playthrough. But this time I felt what I'd hoped I would feel from the beginning. I felt what I should have felt from the beginning. I felt like I was in complete control of the pacing of fights. This wasn't just Dark Souls with a lightning-fast shinobi who wielded a magical prosthetic arm. This wasn't just Bloodborne with a katana that could miraculously block all incoming attacks. This was Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice. So with this newfound understanding of the game, where do I stand on it now? What issues changed? What issues disappeared? And what stayed the same? Well, firstly, let's tackle what issues have disappeared. Despite it still being inconsistent, and still not really being okay that From isn't giving players stable options, the performance feels worlds better. When TrueMotion isn't trying to convert an inconsistent 45 to 55 frames per second into a flat 120 frames per second, it feels significantly less juddery. Deflection feels much more responsive, and are nearly instant, allowing for some really close calls and precise timing. Though I still feel like the visual feedback could be improved. It took me a decent amount of time to really get used to being able to swiftly recognize when I was deflecting and when I wasn't. When half a dozen attacks are coming at you in a second or so, and especially when your posture increases whether you deflect or not, it takes some getting used to being able to instantly realize when you fail or succeed at an individual deflection. I was facing super fast-paced fights with long deflection combos far before I really got it down to just a glance, so maybe rather than just making the audio and visual effects for a proper deflection stronger, they could have also made a proper deflection a more striking color. A slightly brighter shade of yellow-orange just doesn't feel like quite enough. Still, the system itself works fantastically. Similarly, most everything else feels infinitely more responsive than I first came to know. Attacks come out and cancel quicker, menus respond instantly, I can recover quicker, blocks and healing respond quicker, jumps, dodges, sprinting, nearly everything is quicker. The only thing that still feels sloppy is how long it takes to transition from a sprint to a sprint jump. There's still a good half a second between you starting to hold sprint and when you can finally jump out of it. Consistent with Dark Souls and Bloodborne, but it feels out of place here. Overall, the game feels highly responsive, and the buffer system feels just right. I can't quite tell whether it's shorter than it was in previous games, but at very least it's not any longer than it was before, which is good. The 8-way jump, meanwhile, is definitely the major issue that was changed, but not completely resolved on my second playthrough. The input lag certainly exacerbated the problem, but it's still there normally. I don't really see any reason why the jump has to be gated at all, especially since it can have such a drastic impact on gameplay when even just a single jump is misdirected. It's something you can get used to, particularly if you try to specifically only jump toward things using the 4 cardinal directions, but it's still frustrating that the issue is there at all, considering people repeatedly complain every time From gates actions like dodge rolls in this way. The relationship between how swiftly an enemy recovers posture and how far depleted their health is also improved without the input lag. To be clear, the relationship itself is the same, but when the game is responding properly to your inputs, it's a lot easier to punish the openings, meaning that you can much more effectively control this relationship if you're on point. It punishes mistakes that allow the enemy room to breathe, while also rewarding persistence in a multitude of ways. It also allows players to tackle challenges in multiple ways, and each way can be stacked, rather than having to choose one strategy over another. Posture is honestly one of the best mechanics in this game, and maybe in the series. Particularly with the removal of stamina and the addition of swift deflections as more of a passing defense rather than a major counterattack like parries are in Dark Souls, the system just feels fantastic. The camera, meanwhile, can be just as much of a trash heap whether you have an hour of input lag or literally none at all. It loves getting in the way, which is really incongruent with the often small or complex arenas you can find fiercer enemies in, and the fast pace of the game. So many games have solved this problem using things like an intangible camera and dithered objects when they pass in front of the camera, so frankly, it's just plain unacceptable that this is still a problem. I should not have to fight the game like this. You can still get used to it, but some of my closest shaves during my second playthrough were still caused entirely by the camera. Speaking of arena sizes, they still don't always work with the healing and ability to regain posture. The game responding faster without input lag certainly helps give you just a bit more time. But there are a handful of enemies that just refuse to let up. The two main examples I can think of off the top of my head are the Lone Shadow Longswordsman at the bottom of the Ashina Reservoir well, where you start the game, and the Double Guardian Ape fight. It's not that it's impossible to recover during these fights, rather the issue is that it's somewhat up to luck whether you get the chance to or not, since the aggressiveness of the enemies doesn't pair well with the arena at all in this regard. Unfortunately, the only solution I have for this is a bigger arena. Not elegant, but it would work. I understand that part of the challenge, particularly with the Lone Shadow Longswordsman, is supposed to be the cramped arena, but it only works with the offensive part of your arsenal. This is especially true considering your posture recovers slower as your health is lower, just like your enemies. So as soon as you take damage, you're on a timer, because if you don't find a way to heal, you'll never recover posture fast enough. It just translates to a battle that I don't feel is quite fair. Though at least the Guardian Apes will never attack simultaneously, even if it can be torturous trying to convince the correct one to attack, which is also down to luck to some degree, since so many factors are involved in how the AI makes that decision. My issue with death and dragon rot is still perfectly valid meanwhile. The game tells you that NPCs get sick and start coughing when dragon rot takes hold of them. It doesn't tell you what this means at all. I was afraid NPCs would start getting sicker and sicker and eventually start disappearing, preventing me from doing things like buying supplies or upgrading my tools. As it turns out, all it really means is that you can't continue with any side quests related to that character. Still a big deal in some instances, but not the end of the world for a first playthrough. They really should have just been honest about this, because it can too easily lead to people wasting tons of time and effort trying to avoid a punishment they wouldn't otherwise be concerned with, particularly since it's not even really an interesting punishment that benefits from being hidden. So let people choose for themselves whether they want to play it that way. Moving on to things that weren't affected by the input lag at all either way, there are two strange quirks with the health and posture system that I felt were worth pointing out. Despite how much I like them, I don't think they're perfect. The first issue is that if you run out of healing items and have low health, you are more or less guaranteed to lose against enemies you have to deflect to punish, because you often can't recover posture quickly enough at that point. You can deflect perfectly, but one mistake means death, and there is really no option to take it slow. This isn't necessarily wrong, but it really leaves the player asking why they would try at all when their healing is depleted, which is a shame, since that's often the time when players do their best and get the best high from overcoming a tough challenge. Giving everything when you have almost nothing left should feel awesome, but in Sekiro, your posture will recover so slowly that it inherently feels like a losing battle. The other issue is that sometimes your attack power or max posture can just feel too low, dragging fights out. I don't know what alternative rewards they could have given out for defeating bosses, but attack power feels like a superfluous addition that just unbalances things. Same with the max posture growth. Health should have been the only stat that grows if you ask me, and the later enemies and bosses should have had lower health, posture, and posture damaging potential to compensate. Balance everything around the core wolf, rather than the assumptions for what content they will have tackled up to that point. Don't make it a guessing game. It's not an enormous problem, of course, and everything can be done with a completely unleveled wolf, but I can't help but to ask why the system even exists then. There's the Demon Bell and New Game Pluses and all that stuff for people who want a harder challenge. Combat arts and ninjutsu, meanwhile, still feel a bit meh. They're not bad by any means, and they all still have legitimate uses, but, and this goes for some of the prosthetic tools too, some of them just feel a bit too contextual and niche. What's more, the issue where you might accidentally do a combat art when trying to cancel an attack with a block or vice versa still exists without the input lag. They should have found a different way to activate combat arts, honestly, to avoid this problem wholesale, because it just doesn't feel good to be so fast on your reaction that it actually serves as a detriment because the wrong ability comes out, leading to you getting hit. On another note, the singular Guardian Ape fight is now one of my favorite in the entire series, both because each phase is genuinely unique and interesting, the second one being particularly creepy the first time, but also because it getting back up for round 2 was an amazing surprise that I'll remember forever. I actually like the surprise extra forms for bosses after you know about them. They feel just right on a second playthrough, and did offer a good aesthetic surprise, but I can't ignore the fact that they can feel cheap on your first playthrough, particularly if you're throwing everything at the boss, including limited quantity consumables, to try and beat them, only to find out that it has another phase after that. I'm honestly still not quite sure why From Software includes limited consumables. Just put them in the shop infinitely and make them more expensive. You're already limiting how much a person can carry into battle anyway, so it's not like it's unbalanced if you do that. The only other minor criticism I have is that sometimes it takes a second for the death blow option to actually activate, even after the icon has shown up. On both playthroughs, this became a problem against the Shichimen warriors, where unless I was doing the air death blow, there was about a 75% chance that Wolf would just continue slashing at the boss rather than actually use the death blow. The boss would then recover, and on an occasion or two would immediately teleport, needlessly putting me in harm's way through no fault of my own. After everything, where do I actually land with Sekiro? How good or bad is it really? Well, firstly, if you're someone who is good at skill-based, action and reaction-focused combat, I believe Sekiro is one of the easiest Souls-like games. It's still definitely challenging, and as people have said, both the second Owl fight and the final boss don't pull any punches. They require a ton of skill and intense consistency. Still, I think that bosses like the Dark Lurker or Nameless King are arguably more challenging overall. Even just the ability to stealth through a lot of the game does serve to lessen the challenge quite a bit. However, don't take that to mean that I think the game is lesser because it's potentially easier. It most certainly isn't. It's interesting because after playing through Nioh for the first time, I felt naked going back to Bloodborne, where I could no longer block attacks. Likewise, while I played through Sekiro, the Nioh 2 alpha happened to become available. And playing Nioh now makes me feel naked when compared to Sekiro, since I can't really deflect. Yes, there's a deflect mechanic, but it's not the same. It's a tertiary mechanic at best, and it's really limited in use and effort, whether we're talking the regular parries or the timely guard. In Nioh, it serves more like a Dark Souls parry. This kind of means that Nioh is defensive or offensive. You block and dodge, or you attack and parry. Sekiro's deflect is a middle ground where you're using it defensively to avoid attacks, while also raising the posture of your enemy, which is offensive. In a way, this makes Sekiro feel like the true, pure combination of Dark Souls and Bloodborne's design choices, ratcheted up to 11. Despite some imperfections, Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice is one of the best Souls-like games From Software has ever released, by far. more. For every decision that struggles just a bit, there are another dozen so astonishing that they transform the entire experience, and make this a title that's decidedly beautiful and fair. It upholds and refines the rules Miyazaki has set out for this series, and concerns itself far more with being rewarding than being difficult. But what do you guys think? Have you played through Sekiro? Are you having problems that I didn't mention here? What's your favorite part of the experience? Sound off in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.